Good afternoon and welcome to Open Studio right here on DSTV channel 263. My name is Pimelo Mhlanga, aka the P-Master, and I'm your host for today's show. Now, today's show we are joined by an author, a senior journalist, a radio presenter, as well as the author of a book titled Killing Karoline here on studio, which is going to be the subject of today's interview. Now, imagine this, right? A white British woman who's engaged actually gets into an affair with her black employer, falls pregnant, and then after that gives birth to a child who is pale. And then at a later stage, the child's features actually start showing, and the husband, the white husband of which the woman is engaged with, start realizing that this child is not theirs. And what happens after that is completely going to leave you both intrigued and shocked. And of course, we have that baby, 38 years rather, a little bit later, right here on studio with us, and she's going to be taking us through that story. Caroline, rather Sarah Jane, welcome to the show.
Thank you, thanks for having me.
I said Caroline, forgive me for that.
It happens, don't worry.
It really does, because of, I believe, with the conversation that we had leading to this, it's actually what led to that. But take us through your story. I already mentioned some of the introductory part of it. What happens after? What happened after actually your biological mother gave out your paternity?
So I mean, you framed it exactly as it is. It was 1980. We were in the dark days of apartheid, and my biological mother had had an affair with my dad, with this black guy. And after she realizes that I can't possibly be her white husband's child. They have to come up with a plan. Obviously, they couldn't keep me. She didn't want to keep me. I was a black child. And so with the doctors at the time, they came up with this plan that they would say that I had an illness that needed to have specialist treatment. So, and that treatment needed to be in London.
So the doctors were involved?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And so they flew me to the UK. My biological mother and her husband took me to the UK, handed me over and to my adoptive parents, and came back to South Africa, where they told everyone, they came back without a baby, and they told everyone that Caroline had died. Oh
wow, that is a very, even earlier on, like when we were speaking about it leading towards this, it really just shook me so much. Now tell us about that you grew up in England. Tell us about that part of your life.
Listen, I had a really, for the very early part of my life, I had what most people would consider to be an idyllic childhood. You know, my parents were very comfortably off. We had a nice house. We went to nice schools. But my parents were white. My adoptive parents were white. And there's always going to be that issue of white parents raising black children, particularly adoptees who already have this quite a confused sense of identity, and then add to that the transracial adoption, which becomes problematic.
No, so what is the earliest memory of you actually realizing this puzzle? Take us through that time.
People always ask me that as an adoptive person, like when did you find out? And there was no big surprise. My parents, to their credit, had always told us that we were adopted. And so I'm not even sure how they did that. I guess from day one it was a narrative, but the details I didn't know about. And people always say, but you must have known, you would have known anyway because your parents were white and you were black. But actually, I didn't. The concept of race isn't really something that children are aware of. Children are very accepting of just the situation, and if your parents look different to you, they look different to you. So it was actually other people that said, you can't be your parents, when they met us, you can't be your parents' children.
All right, now take us through the time now where you find out about, apart from you actually having to deal with your parents, I believe that there are other things that you had to deal with, as you just mentioned now, that the issue of race as well, and people actually also taking note of that. What are some of the things that you had to deal with that became a load to you, a heavy load?
I think the fact that, I grew up in the UK, but I didn't grow up in London, which is a very diverse area. I grew up in the countryside, in a very small village. I don't think I saw another black person in real life as opposed to on television until I was about 12 or 13. Can you imagine?
Wow.
So the fact was, I had no mirrors. There was nobody that looked like me. All my friends were little blonde girls with swinging hair and whatever. And you know, I talk about this in the book, like the hair issue. It's a big deal.
Yeah, it is.
You know,
it really is, and I can imagine.
The people used to want to touch my hair. They want to, you know, oh, it feels like a sheep. All this kind of stuff that really othered me from the kids that I grew up with. And of course there was the usual racism that happens in society. And so those were the things that I was dealing with, not having any mirrors, not having people who looked like me to reflect on and to have that. So that was difficult. And particularly as I entered my teen years, and I think this is true of a lot of teenagers and going through adolescence, you're desperate to find a sense of identity, and I didn't have one.
Well, I can imagine that, man. Well, we're going to be going to an ad break right now. When you come back, we're going to be continuing with the conversation right here with Sarah-Janeking. Make sure that you stay right there on Open Studios DSTV channel 263. And welcome back to the break right here on Open Studios DSTV channel 263. Just in case you just joined us, we are joined by Sarah-Janeking. She is a senior journalist. She's a radio presenter as well as an author of the book Killing Karoline. And of course, we are having a conversation about some of the contents of her book, speaking about her life story. Sarah, welcome back to Open Studio.
Thank you.
All right, now before the break, we got more into understanding and speaking about your story. But right now, I want you to tell me about the force that actually made you to move from England and actually come to South Africa.
Okay, so actually, and this is funny because people always think there was some big thing that I was like, I must come back to South Africa. What was actually happening was that I'd moved to Dubai. I was living and working in Dubai, and a whole load of, I guess I came face to face with my demons. I was addicted to drugs and alcohol, and so that really I needed to get help. And somebody had said to me, why don't you go to rehab and why don't you go to South Africa? So as much as I always thought one day I would come back, I didn't know that it would be to come and get clean from drugs and alcohol.
Oh, wow.
And it just so happens that the rehab that I went to in Joburg was about 2 or 3 roads away from the hospital where I was born.
Oh, wow. So you actually finding yourself having to deal with drugs and all this, was it actually caused by all this that you had to deal with? What led you to actually finding yourself at that state in your life?
I think it has a large thing to do with it. I think we all are desperate for a sense of identity, and if you don't have that, you look for that in very dangerous and destructive places, or you try and reach a kind of oblivion. You want to black it all out, and I think that's what I was doing for a number of years, with the drugs, with alcohol, with eating disorders, with self-harm, a whole load of really destructive behaviors that eventually came to a head when I was living in Dubai. And so it was imperative really for me to survive that I got help, and I did.
Yeah, well, I believe with all that you actually went through, most people actually go through that, and you having to deal with it being at that part of the world, it must have been, you know, a very difficult phase of your life. But how long ago was this? And as well, take us through how this has actually taught you to be able to deal with disappointment through the stages of you now healing and moving away from the bad habits that you had uploaded.
So it was about 12 years ago, almost to the day, that I touched down for the first time in South Africa, and I always describe that feeling, and I write about it in the book, of the wheels touching down at OR Tambo and me feeling this sense of I'm home. And I'd never been here before.
It was your first time.
It was my first time here. I came in, we flew in, it was about 5, 6 o'clock in the evening, this beautiful Johannesburg sunset, and something just said, this is home to me. And I never really left after that. I mean, I went back to the UK for a while here and there, but yeah, so that was it for me, and I spent 8 months in rehab, which is a long time, processing a lot of the stuff. And it was really valuable. It was, of course, I had to get clean from alcohol and drugs. But I think the last 12 years has been outside of rehab has been a healing process for me. Every day is a day for recovery, and every day is a day for reflection. But I think the grounding that I got, the fact that I had to really go back to those core issues that were troubling me, that set me on the path of recovery. So you asked about disappointment. I mean, disappointment is a part of life.
Yeah.
Regret is a part of life to an extent, but it's about not letting it eat at you, and not letting it be your driving force.
True. Yeah, that's very true. And as you're saying, that is part of life. Everyone actually faces disappointment, but it's all about how you get to a point of not letting it actually bring you down. You understand? It takes so much strength and so much courage. And there's a saying that goes that courage is never in the absence of fear. Now, there's a part where you mentioned that your biological mother actually said that you will never be able to meet to find your father. Now, did you believe that? And take us through that.
So I had contacted my biological mother when I was about 21. I'd never felt a need to prior to that, but I was at that point in my life where that was something I wanted to do. So I contacted her, I wrote her a letter, and she replied and basically said, "You're the worst mistake I ever made. Don't contact me again. Don't contact anyone in South Africa. And as far as your father goes, there's no hope of you ever knowing anything more about him than the very basic information that she had."
So after that conversation, you never had an encounter with her, or
No.
you've never had an encounter
Never.
with her till this point?
Until this point, and probably until the day I die.
And how did you take that, actually? Her saying, I can imagine, like, just receiving that right now, it must have been difficult,
Devastating.
being referred to as a worst mistake.
It was absolutely devastating, and that was a point, that secondary rejection. We talk in adoption about the primal wound, which is the separation of a baby from its biological mother. It's the most unnatural thing in the world, and many adoptees experience this thing of the primal wound, which is this, I guess you could describe it as a hole in the soul that you can never quite piece together.
Yeah.
To then have that rejection years later, a secondary rejection, was really painful, and I guess kind of sparked really the spiral into those destructive behaviors. It was difficult at that time.
All right, now I see you managed to actually find your father, right?
I did.
And take us through that, because I believe after your mother actually had rejected you like that, what actually made you to want to continue to also want to find your father? When you fearing that maybe you might face the same rejection that your mother actually gave you from your father, and was he even aware of you, that you existed?
To speak to the rejection, I was terrified. However, there was a part of me as a South African, as a black South African, that needed to find my father. I had to. So much of our identity as black people comes from where we are from.
Yeah.
And that was absolutely crucial to me. It wasn't even a question that I wouldn't. And for a long time, I looked for him, and I had, really basic information to go on. And it was only after the book, it was about 6 months after the book came out, and I was doing an interview, and with Koketso Sachani on 702, and he said to me, "I know that you want to find your father." He kind of caught me unawares, actually. He said, "I know you want to find your father. Why don't you give his name now?" And in the book, I had changed names because I wanted to protect people who maybe necessarily didn't deserve protecting. But
all right, I'm going to ask you to hold it right there. We're going to be continuing with it when you come back from the break, right? Make sure that you also stay right there. We are going to be continuing and wrapping the conversation when you come back to the last segment of the show right here on Open Studios DSTV channel 263. Welcome back to the last segment of the show right here, Open Studios on DSTV channel 263. Of course, you're still tuned in with myself, Phemelo Mhlanga, aka the P Master, here with Sarah-Janeking. Now, before the break, she was just telling us about the story of when now she finally met her father, and this is something that happened so recent, and she's just going to continue to take us through that. Sarah, welcome back to the last segment of the show.
Thanks.
And now take us through, you are still taking us through the story of you finding your father. Let's take it off where we left off before the break.
So I was doing a radio interview, and the host of the show said, "Why don't you give your father's real name?" Because I'd been desperate. I'd hired private investigators, couldn't find him. And Black Twitter galvanized, as we tend to do. And less than 24 hours later, there was a message in my inbox saying, could this be him? And so I called, and it was him.
It was him. So how were you certain that was him?
Because he'd worked I knew that my father had worked at the Balalaika Hotel in Johannesburg.
Yeah.
So I asked him, did you used to work at the Balalaika Hotel? And the first thing he said was no. Imagine. He said no. And then just as I was about to put the phone down, he said it was a really long time ago. And then I knew.
That it was him.
Yeah.
Well, now this happened, so I'm so fascinated by the fact that it is so recent. I mean, it is so much in a later stage of your life. Saying that you spoke to your mother at the, when you were 21, and then so many years later, you are finally reunited with your father. Tell us about your relationship with him right now, because you say it happened recently, this past December, right?
Yeah.
That is so recent. Tell us about your relationship with him for the past few months. How have that been for you?
It's been, I mean, meeting him was the best moment of my life. I don't think anything will ever top that.
Yeah.
And it's just been amazing. I mean, he's my dad. I call him Dad. He's a typical father. You know, he calls me and says, "Are you eating? Have you got petrol?" All of that kind of stuff. Yeah. No, he's the most wonderful man. And I write in the book, you know, if all the mud and mire and dirt and black had come from her, then all the good and the music and light had come from him. And it really is true. He is the most phenomenal man. As are my siblings. If I don't mention them, they'll get very upset. My siblings are my siblings are awesome. Yeah.
Oh, I can imagine. But now I'm interested in finding out also about your relationship with your adopted parents at this point.
So my adoptive father passed away when I was about 21, 22.
Oh, wow.
And my mom lives in the UK. And you know, we have a mother-daughter relationship which has its highs and lows. And people always ask me, how did she feel about the book? And I think there were parts in there that were probably quite difficult for her. But ultimately, she's just very proud of me, which is beautiful.
Yeah, no, that it absolutely is amazing, and also that you so owned up to your story, owned your truth, and actually also shared it with the world, because I believe that could also impact so many other people, and you don't know who else your story actually touched just as much, you see. Now, take us through the book. It covers a number of issues around, racial identity and also transracial adoptions. Take us through what the book actually touches on the...
So, I mean, those themes, obviously race and identity, which has a huge place, not just in South Africa currently, but I think globally we are beginning to look more at issues of race. We're beginning to talk about things like white privilege, as uncomfortable as it makes some people. Black consciousness seems to be having a revival, which I think is a beautiful thing. And identity, that's something that everyone can relate to. Everyone can relate to that sense of identity. It's one of the most core things that we have as humans. It also touches on the book mental health issues, addiction, obviously, and just life.
Life in general. That is so interesting. Now, what other themes actually, you just mentioned a few others, but what other core themes do you feel like actually the book touches base on, and what is it that you are hoping that a person who reads your book would be able to take out from it?
I mean, I think one of the most important things for me, it was about being my most authentic self and telling my truth. I think it was Oprah, and I can't believe I'm quoting Oprah, but who once said, no one tells our stories better than we do ourselves.
Yeah, true.
And I think that is hugely important, particularly again for us as Black people, to be telling our own stories and not constantly have our stories told through a white lens. I think that's really important.
Yeah, it is.
But for me, the most important thing for me was that everything that I wrote in the book was my truth. I wasn't trying to write anybody else's story, and there were a few people from my biological mother's side who were very upset about the book because it revealed the truth, which up until last year, people had continued to believe that baby Karoline had died. But that's their story, and they can always write a book if they would like to.
That is so true. All right. Now, would you say that, this book was a resurrection of your resurrection, from the dead? Because I believe, as you're saying just now, that everyone actually believed that you were no more, and now would you say that when you now finally released the book Killing Karoline, you were like waking up from the dead?
Absolutely. The writing process was horrible. It was very painful. I didn't really enjoy it.
Yeah, I can
but
imagine.
it needed to come out.
Yeah.
As soon as I held that book in my hands, suddenly Sarah-Janeking was a valid, worthwhile person. And it's been so powerful for me as a person. And the feedback that I get on the book, not a day goes by that I don't open my inbox and somebody has sent me a message saying, I loved your book and thank you. And you know, what's interesting is that now we're in a democracy. There are going to be a lot more Sarah-Jane-Kings wandering around. There's going to be a lot more mixed race people because it's no longer illegal for black and white people to have relationships. Transracial adoption is really sort of booming, if that's the appropriate word in South Africa. So there's going to be a lot of people, I think, that are going to need this book.
Yeah. All right. Now, quickly, just before we wrap up, tell us how can people actually be able to get a hold of the book if they would like to get it, and also how they can be able to get a hold of you as well.
Okay, so the books are everywhere. Exclusives, the Book Lounge, Reader's Warehouse, everywhere. You can order on Loot. And if people want to get in touch with me, they can go to all of my social media, which is at This Is SJ King.
At This Is SJ King. Right. Thank you so much for joining us on the studio
and
sharing your story with us. I must say, I'm very touched, and I'm very somehow also inspired by your courage and how you actually came out from all of this, a strong person that you are at this point in time, and sharing your story with the world. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Pamela.
All right, man. And also thank you guys as well for tuning into the show, hoping that you managed to pick up as much as possible for you. Remember, go out there and get that book for yourself so that you can follow the story of Sarah-Janeking, Killing Karoline. Thank you so much. And of course, from us here on Open Studios, thank you, and the crew itself. Stay blessed. Until we meet again, goodbye.